Hi, thank you very much for coming. As Ken mentioned, I was invited here as I was a previous worker for the Friends of Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park. I was asked to give a talk on beetles. It's an interest of mine, but I didn't really know where to pitch it, so I've kind of gone a little bit of worldwide, a little bit of Britain, a little bit of the Cemetery Park specific, catering to hopefully quite a broad audience. So if there are some things that I maybe missed, then feel free to ask at the end. But yeah, let's go. So this is, like I said, a very broad introduction, a little bit of an introduction to me. There's me up in a tree where I'd rather be than stuck in my room right now. So my background is that essentially I started work, my first job was in nature conservation for the RSPB. I then started to work for people like ZSL London Zoo, doing research in terms of conservation. When I was at ZSL, my job was looking at dung beetles and how they were threatened and writing sort of risk and extinction red list reports. So whenever you hear in the news, say 80% of a certain kind of species is threatened with extinction, I was writing those reports about dung beetles. So that's kind of a little bit of where my interest in beetles started. From then, I went to the Natural History Museum for a bit, and I was kind of one of those people who, when the Natural History Museum goes off to somewhere exotic and they bring back several bags full of exciting specimens, I was the first person on the microscope just sort of sorting out what was what, so that they could go sent to all the different experts around the building. So certainly not an expert myself, but got to see a lot of very exciting things there. After that, I joined the Friends. So I was a cemetery park officer for a while. Had a great time, got to know the site pretty well, so hopefully I can bring some of that experience and knowledge to this talk here. But then when it came time to leave, I decided I was going to go on a bit of an adventure. Went off to Honduras for a while to do some monitoring of dung beetles. So this picture of me up in the tree, that is me in the cloud forests of Honduras. And while I was there, I was looking at beetles, moths, all sorts of things. And then since coming back, I've been finishing up my master's studies, looking more at genetics and how we can use genetics for identification and use that information in wider ecological study. So very much my sort of things I do now is much more lab-based and sitting behind a computer number crunching rather than being out in the field, unfortunately. So beetles, what are beetles? I've put a little taxonomy down the side to the right here. Just so you can have a little familiarization of kind of how the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genera, species things work. I'm going to be talking a lot about families and species today, so just so you can give yourself a little hint as to what I'm talking about there with those. So first of all, what are beetles? They are animals, so they're in the kingdom animal. They're not a plant, they're not a bacteria or anything like that. Arthropoda, so that basically means jointed leg. So they are invertebrates, so they're not in the same grouping as things like the mammals and the birds and the fish, but they're legged, so they're not associated with things like worms and sponges and things like that. Insecta. So insecta, on the left, you can see 4 pictures. Hopefully you'll all recognize those as being insects. Hopefully you'll also recognize one of them as not being an insect. So in the, sorry, not an insect, sorry. Hopefully you'll recognize one of those as not being a beetle. So the bottom right, you've got a butterfly. A butterfly I find is a really good explanation of what an insect is, because you can see it really clearly. Insect is basically means it's got the body plan of a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. So there you can see the head with the eyes, the antenna, and the little mouth part coming off. And then you've got the thorax, where attached to it, you've got 3 pairs of legs on the flower there, and then 2 pairs of wings, a forewing and a hind wing. And then at the back, you've got the abdomen, which is kind of all the digestive stuff and the reproductive organs. If you look at those beetles that we've got around the page there, those are basically exactly the same body plan, but just modified. So you'll see you've got the head at the front, where you can see the antenna and eyes, and then you've got the thorax, but the thorax kind of extends underneath and over the top of the abdomen. So the legs kind of look like they're coming out towards the back, but they're actually part of the thorax. And then on top, you've got, instead of having 2 pairs of wings, the forewings are highly modified to become this hard sort of shell called the elytra. and those cover up wings and protect the wings and make them very hard and very protected. So we've got about 400,000 described species of beetle all around the world. That is only a fraction of how many is predicted to actually be around the world. So there's meant to be over 1 million species around the world, but undescribed yet. In the UK, we've got 4,000 species of beetles. So that is quite a lot. I can only touch on a little bit of those through this talk, and there's quite a lot of variety. So hopefully I'll touch on a few different types, but sorry if your favorite isn't included. Just to give you a little bit of context for that, it's always kind of been said that beetles are the most species-rich group in the world, and the numbers back that up. However, it's thought that maybe wasps and the Hymenoptera might be catching up, because lots of things will have a parasite that is a wasp, and lots of those wasps will then have a parasite that is another wasp, and so you get this sort of chain of parasites and parasites and parasitoids and all of that. And the numbers are kind of indicating that maybe actually wasps and the Hymenoptera are a bit more species rich in the long run. So now we vaguely know what a beetle is, I want to just cover some common mistakes. What are not beetles? So on the left, we've got two pictures of two beetles. We've got one on the very left, so you've got a beetle that you can find in the UK, and then to the right of that, there's a Honduran example that I've got. And then on the right, we've got two pictures of Hemiptera, or the true bugs. Hemiptera are not that closely related to beetles. They're insects, but they're often mistaken for beetles. People often think of them as one and the same. So I'm just going to give you a couple of clues as to how you can differentiate between the two if you're out in the field. So when I was talking about the elytra, the hardened wings earlier of beetles, hopefully on the left picture, you can see that the elytra meet in the middle and go straight down, and hopefully you can see that little line that I've drawn crudely there. Whereas on the Hemiptera, their two pairs of wings are folded over, in some cases, in this cross shape. So if you see that cross shape, it means it's likely to be a Hemiptera rather than a beetle, a Coleoptera. To the right of those pictures, you can see my beetle with its large biting mouth parts. So beetles are known for having biting mouth parts, whereas the Hemiptera, you can see the true bug has this sort of siphonous rostrum, which is basically a straw, a puncturing straw. So they use that to puncture into plants, suck out all of the sugary juices. Some species like to puncture into people and animals and suck out blood. But basically they're known as sap suckers. They suck out fluids from inside of plants or animals, whereas beetles, biting mouth parts. But I will say, while there are some things in the UK, some species like the stag beetles that have quite large biting mouth parts, they won't do you any harm. They're usually quite weak. The best you'll get is maybe a little nibble, but they won't be able to break the skin. This specimen, the best beetle that I'm holding in my hands there, that was quite large, and that one did give me quite a bite and take out quite a bit of my skin. But you won't find anything like that here. So I said that the front wings, the forewings are modified into these hardened elytra. That gives them fantastic protection so that their wings aren't damaged. It means that they can kind of take a bit of a bruising. And as you can see on the left, I've got two pictures of a dung beetle. That's the female and the male of the same species. And you can see I've kind of unhooked some of the wings from one of them, so you can see how those wings tuck in underneath those elytra. So as they sort of open up the elytra, they expand their wings out, as you can see in the cockchafer on the right, and then when they land, they sort of tuck them in. Because of this style of flight, they can be quite visible when they're flying, so they have to have their elytra out sort of in a V, so that their wings have enough room to move. That means that they can be a little bit not particularly precise when they're flying. So people always kind of say they're a bit worried about bats ending up in their hair because they seem to fly around and fly quite close. Bats are incredibly precise flyers. Beetles are kind of the opposite, and they will often end up sort of bashing into things. We used to get these cockchafers smashing into my kitchen window back when I was a kid, and I thought someone was throwing stones at the window, and then you'd find them sort of lying on the ground outside. Yeah, so that's a little bit about their flight. A little bit of their life history as well. I'm going to say I'm when I'm talking about beetles, I'm going to be slightly biased, and usually I'll be referring to the adult stage. But as you can see here, they have quite a complex life history. So this is the 7-spot ladybird that we're going to talk about later. And you can see that basically there's 4 different life stages. You see on the left here is when they're laying the eggs. So the eggs hatch and out pop these larvae. Beetles experience complete metamorphosis. So they're very similar to a butterfly, where you'll have a caterpillar that pupates and then out comes a butterfly that looks very different from the caterpillar. Some groups, such as the Hemiptera that I mentioned earlier, the true bugs or the dragonflies or the grasshoppers, experience incomplete metamorphosis, where once they hatch from the egg, they kind of look like the adult version of them, but just a little bit different. They haven't developed the wings, they don't have the sexual organs, all of that sort of stuff. And they just kind of get bigger and bigger as they grow, and then they start to look like the adults. Beetles have a complete metamorphosis, so often the adults will look nothing like the larvae that we have here. So this is a really perfect example of this. So I'm going to start talking about different families that are very common in the UK, or can be found in the UK, or species rich. And then I'll start talking about a few examples that you can find in the cemetery park when you're allowed out in your state-sanctioned exercises and all of that. So first up, the Coccinellidae, the ladybirds. So I have a lot of scientific names here because it's good for me to practice with them. I will stumble as I pronounce them, but I will also say what their common name is if there is an appropriate common name for them. So ladybirds, I imagine most people know what a ladybird looks like when they if they're asked to think of one, and it'll probably look like something like one of the 2 pictures in the left in the middle. On the right, though, the Scimnus scuturalis. This is an example of a ladybird that we have in the UK, and actually about half of our species in the UK are much more reminiscent of this one on the right than they are the bright, shiny ones on the left. So we've got about 55 species, and about half of those are large, colourful, often have these sort of dots that we think of, and the others are a bit smaller, maybe a bit drab. So this one here is on the end of a pine needle. So if you think of how big a pine needle is, not particularly big. This is even smaller than that. So the actual name Coccinellidae comes from Coccinella, which means scarlet. So it's referring to the bright reds. So obviously they were named after these very colourful ones. On the left, we've got our 7-spot ladybird. And in the middle, we've got the harlequin ladybird, which is one that many people might have heard of. It's a very recent arrival in the UK. And it's kind of spread very rapidly. It's got very high numbers. It's the one that I tend to find in my windowsill when I wake up when spring sort of arrives, and you open up the window for the first time, and you find all these ladybirds hiding away in there that have been trying to overwinter close to the warmth. Here are some that you might find in the cemetery park. And I want to bring your attention to this picture on the right, which is our Harmonia axioridis, which is the harlequin ladybird, and how many different colour forms it can have. So there is a huge variety of colour forms they have, and a lot of those colour forms look very similar to species that we have in the UK. So that can really confuse things here. So I thought I'd just focus on a few very simple ones that you're not going to confuse with anything else. So on the left, we've got our Coccinella septempunctata, which is our 7-spot ladybird. And hopefully you can see why it's called that. You've got 3 spots on each elytra and then 1 sort of shared spot at the front. So that makes you 7 spots. There's a little bit of color variation in this species, but ultimately, if you've seen that with 7 spots in that sort of order, you know what you've got. Hopefully you know what sort of size that is. I don't have any size scale in any of this, I'm afraid. But the Adalia bipunctata, so the 2-spot ladybird, it is much smaller. Again, some variability, but most of the forms look exactly like this with 1 spot on each elytra, and is very easy to identify there. Something a bit more interesting, the Silobora vigentidupunctata. So that's the 22-spot ladybird. Again, that's a really small one. That's similar size to the Adalia bipunctata, the 2-spot. It's bright yellow. There are a few different yellow ones, but again, if you count the spots on this, you'll know you've got the 22 spot rather than something like the 14 or the 16 spot ladybird. So ladybirds, a little bit about them. They're very much predators. So with lots of different varieties of things that beetles eat, but these are very much predators. And you mostly see that when they're in their larval form and they're running around catching aphids, but also they're quite cannibalistic. So the larvae will eat often their own siblings or ones of the same species, but they'll also eat the larvae of other ladybirds. So basically they'll kind of eat whatever they can get. So carabids. These are the ground beetles. They are very species rich, 360 we have in the UK. These are ones that you see really easily in the cemetery park and around. But you lift up any log, any stone, you will often get these hanging around, and they'll often very quickly scurry off. They are called ground beetles because lots of them have lost their ability to fly. So underneath their elytra, they don't have wings, or they have reduced wings. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And their real prowess is running around very quick. There's a few groups called the tiger beetles, which if you look at videos of them running around, they are like Olympic sprinters running around. They have an extended part of their leg called the trochanter, which is filled with muscle. And they use that to really push themselves through all the leaf litter. And what they're doing is they're hunting. Later on, you'll see some pictures of some with very large eyes. That's generally a really good indicator that they're hunters, because they're looking for all the small things and the little bits of movement so they can run and grab them. They're quite difficult, I would say, to identify apart from a few quite obvious ones. So I've brought up a few different sort of body shapes, I suppose I'd call it, that you can focus in on. So these are all species that you can find in the cemetery park. And so the Amara Aenia on the left, this is a group called the sun beetles. They like to be out in the daytime. A lot of these ground beetles are nocturnal, so they'll run around at night hunting. These are often out in the daytime. You'll often see these running around on the footpaths. They're very small. They just look like a little glimmer in the pathway. But if you get up close to them, they can look quite a nice sort of bronzy golden color. I describe them as having a bit of a seed shape to their outline. If you compare that then to the Notiophilus next to it, this, hopefully you can see from my terrible picture, it has very large eyes, again for hunting. And you can see that there is sort of two reflective streaks going down the back of it. That's where this one gets its name from, Bigutatus, sort of two guttural areas, from my understanding. And yeah, these are, again, very shiny, but you'll have to look around. Often I found these in moss. So if you're looking in on sort of headstones in the moss, you might find some of these. But there's 3 different species, and you probably won't be able to get them 2 species without a microscope or a hand lens. Now, the one on the right, this is Pterosticus madidus. And I would say this looks to me just like a very generic ground beetle, but it's by far the most common one that you'll find in the cemetery park. And so it's a really good one to kind of get looking at to see if it's, basically, I pick one up and I go, is this Pterosticus madidus or is it not? 50% of the time it is. I know what I've got, and then you can kind of start investigating all the other possibilities. Often they have very red legs. This is quite a dark legged specimen from the pictures I could get. And at the back of the thorax, there's a very rounded edge, whereas a lot of other ones will have quite sharp ones. I understand without context, that's probably quite rough to see, but there are more and more now online sort of resources comparing these very similar ground beetles. And I've put a little list of those at the end of the talk so people can check those out. So moving on to the Staphylinidae. So before, there were sort of 300-ish species of the carabids. There's over 1,100 of the staphylinids, the rove beetles. These have quite a similar life cycle to the ground beetles. And again, they're predators. They're adapted to running around in the undergrowth. But the key thing that you can see here for them is that their elytra are very short. So they have wings, usually, that are tucked up inside there. So there's some wonderful videos of them sort of untucking their wings into flight and tucking them back in again. But by having that truncated elytra, it means that they're able to move their abdomen around a lot. And that's great when they're rummaging around in the undergrowth. So it gives them a lot of maneuverability. Again, it's also that they can predate, so they can run around and catch things. And they're great hunters. 1,100 species. There are a lot of staphylinids in the cemetery park. I'm not even going to attempt to try and give you a good rundown because they're very difficult. I've picked out some very obvious looking ones here, but there is one specific staphylinid that lots of people might know, and that is the devil's coach horse Ocypus ollens. So this is a really large beetle, probably around this size, if you can see that. Very matte colored. It has very large mandibles, which look quite aggressive. Again, as I was saying earlier, they can give you a little nibble. They're most likely they'll just sort of cling on to you. You won't feel any pain, but you'll definitely feel it trying to get to you. It won't puncture the skin or anything. And the best thing about them, though, is because they've got this abdomen that they can move around, they like to flick it up. And it often looks like people feel that it's got a sting and it's going to get you with its sting. They don't have a sting at all. As far as I know, there's no beetles around the world that have anything remotely like a sting in that way. Oh, except bombardier beetles. We'll go back to those later. And so, yeah, they're not going to do anything to you. They're just trying to make themselves look aggressive, and they do look very aggressive, but you can pick them up and have a little play with them and then put them back down again. We used to get a lot of these in the lobby area of the Soane Centre. They would somehow find their way into there. The Chrysomelids. So these are the seed and the leaf beetles. And I have to say, the photos don't do them justice, but they're generally the cutest of the beetles that we have. So on the left, there's one that you might recognize, Chrysomelidae americana, or commonly known as the rosemary beetle. If you have any rosemary or lavender in your garden, especially in the city, then you'll very likely have these on them. Again, this is a fairly recent arrival in the UK. It's described as a pest species, but they don't seem to do much damage. I think you just need to make sure you're not accidentally putting them in your lamb roast with your rosemary. They have this really beautiful metallic coloration and a sort of purple and green stripiness to them. To plug a different talk, there was a FSC Field Studies Council talk the other day on invertebrate colouring, which was really fascinating. And it was describing how the metallic colours of beetles is derived from structure rather than pigment. And I highly recommend people check that out if you're interested. So that's a sort of, I would say that's a typical body shape of a Chrysomelid beetle. In the middle, we have a Carabidae species. These are known as the tortoise beetles, and you can see why. They have this, what looks like a sort of a tortoise shell that sort of clings very closely to the vegetation. They're very sweet. I'd say they're fairly difficult to find because they're often, as you can see, quite camouflaged. They don't like to make themselves known, so you have to kind of be looking on leaves to find them. And then on the right, you've got the Psiloides chrysocephala, which is a flea beetle. Again, these are very, very small. Scale is not really working on these presentations, but these are very small. And most of the time you'll see these, it's when you're walking through long grasslands and they're jumping around very quick. You can't really see the legs on this, but they're kind of pinned back tightly like a spring. And so they're basically spring-loaded. They fly very quickly as if they were a flea. But all of these are vegetarians. They eat seeds and they eat leaves, so they're not going to bite you like a flea. So two of these species you're likely to see in the cemetery park. So the two on the right in the middle. As far as I know, we don't have any rosemary and lavender in the cemetery park, so you won't see the rosemary beetle. But here are some other ones that you might see in the cemetery park. The left one, again, might be familiar to gardeners, Lilioceras lilii, also known as the lily beetle, and no guesses to what that eats. This is very common on our Turk's cap lilies that we have in sort of over the fence to Sanctuary Wood and in Ackroyd Drive. They are very bright red, very easily noticed, but what's more noticeable is just the damage that they do to the plant. So you'll often see plant damage, and then you go over and then you'll see the lily beetle there. The Donacia simplex, these are without fail always on the pond at the back of the sown center. So these are, they have an aquatic larval stage. So they feed on the roots of water plants, and then they'll come up and you'll see them on the leaves of, say, the reeds, the Phragmites and the Typha, where they'll reproduce, and they can also skim along the surface on the surface tension of the water. So those are really nice to see. And then on the right here, we've got Chrysomelidae banksii. These are about 1 centimetre big, but they're very robust. They're very chunky. They're very easily spotted, very shiny, very beautiful. However, because they're quite big and they're a little bit slow and dopey, more often than not, you'll see them kind of crushed into the pavement rather than see them alive, unfortunately. Okay, Curculionidea. So these are the weevils. Weevils are incredibly diverse, not as diverse as the Staphylinids in the UK, but they are possibly a bit more difficult. So I'm not going to talk too much about them, but I'm going to just bring them up as sort of examples of variation on a theme. So earlier when I was speaking about the biting mouthparts, if you have a look at this Curculio species on the left, that biting mouthpart is basically at the end of this very long rostrum. So that might look like a sort of a piercing mouthpart that you'd get on one of the true bugs. But if you look very closely at the end, you can see those biting mouthparts. And what they do with that long rostrum is that they bite into something like a seed, a nut, or a bit of plant, and they will then lay an egg in that long tube that they've created, and then the eggs will hatch and the larvae will grow inside of that plant or fruit or whatever it is. So it's a way of distributing their eggs right into the heart of the food source. This one we've got on the right, this is also known as a vine weevil, which again, gardeners might know. This is a specimen that I found on my kitchen ceiling because we've bought some new plants and this had come out of those plants. This is a species that the larvae like to live on the roots of plants, often potted plants. I don't know why that is, but they do really well there. And then they come out as an adult, and the adult doesn't need to sexually reproduce to lay eggs. So they just come on out straight away, lay some eggs on a new plant, so they can be really difficult to get rid of. Right, now, the Scarabidae. This is where kind of my interests lie a little bit more. And so the scarabs are a really broad kind of group. Mostly people know them from, say, the sort of Egyptian imagery of the dung beetles, the sacred scarab, and all of that sort of thing. And you can see on the left the Ontophagus that we have here. Those look quite similar to that sort of imagery. And then on the right, we have a similar shape, but a very shiny Chrysomelidae, which is not a UK species. I've put a picture of that in from Honduras just because it's pretty. The scarabs tend to be vegetation eaters, but sometimes they will eat vegetation that's already been digested. So there are also, a lot of them are dung feeders. So the Chrysina on the right is a vegetation eater, but the Ontophagus on the left are very much dung beetles. They might not do the thing that you think of with a dung beetle, so the whole ball rolling thing. No species in the UK do that. But these ones, they sniff out dung, and you can see that their antenna, they have a club at the end with lots of little lamella on it, and that's used to smell out dung. So when sort of dung gets dropped, they need to get there quite quick, so they need to be able to smell it quite quickly. So they smell it, they go there, they basically bury a hole underneath the dung, and then they stick that hole filled with dung, and then they lay their eggs in it. So essentially what they're doing is they're providing food sources for their young. This is a kind of really unusual sort of aspect of parenting that you don't necessarily see too often in insects, because parenting is quite a complex behavior. And obviously you have things like the social bees and wasps, but outside of them, it's not too common. So some that you might see in Cemetery Park. I'm being a bit hopeful with one of these. But on the left, you've got the Amphimilion solstitale, which is basically a smaller version of what you might know as a cockchafer. These are found, again, in the sort of Aqua Drive sort of area. In the middle, we've got Onthophagus cyanobita, which is these dung beetles. I can't recommend that you go looking for these, but if you were to look for them, I imagine it would be in maybe some of the dung of the police horses as they go past. But obviously, you'd have to have some health and safety precautions in place before you do that. On the right here, Setonia aurata, this is known as a rose chafer. So I might get corrected by Ken or Terry after this, but as far as I know, there's no records of this in the Cemetery Park, certainly not in the Cemetery Park list. But this is a really beautiful species. It eats pollen and flowers, and I've seen it a few times in sort of continental Europe, really beautiful. I was once giving a guided walk in the Cemetery Park, and I realized that I was missing someone. And a few minutes later, they turned up and were like, oh, I got really distracted with this beautiful bright green metallic beetle. So I showed them a picture of this and they were like, yeah, it was definitely that, definitely that. And so we went rummaging around trying to find it and we didn't. But I hope that it's around every now and then. Yeah. Sylphids, the Sylphidae. Now, these are carrion eaters for the most part. So these are very specialized to eat rotting flesh or fungi. And you can see they have exactly the same sort of clubbed system of antennae that you had with the dung beetles. And so they need to be able to smell rotting flesh as it's occurring and get to it. And they do a very similar thing to the dung beetles, where they will provision their nests with this carrion, but they take it another step. So this is a really rare example of really proper parental behavior in insects, where they not only just fill a nest with carrion for it, but they will actually stay with the eggs. They will then start raising their larvae, and they'll partly digest some of the carrion, some of the meat, and they will then give that to their young so that the young can take them in. And what it seems to be is that they are sharing their microbiome, so that all of the bacteria in their digestive system is shared with the young. And that seems to be a way of protecting the young and allowing them to be able to eat slightly more rotten flesh than maybe they would want to eat. So they seem to have a higher tolerance for degraded flesh. So you'll often get these, say, in agriculture. I've seen them most of the time on sheep, but often you'll get them on, say, dead birds. There's no records of these in the Cemetery Park, but we have some similarly related species. So these are another sylphid. This is Sylphiligata. And this looks quite similar. I'm going to flash back. They're quite similar to these ones, but they're actually, you see the small heads there, they are adapted to hunt for snails. So these ones not only eat flesh, but they like to find snails, and their small head is able to get inside the shell and basically get the snail where they think they're safe. So that's a little summary of some of the families, but here are a few interesting ones that don't fit into those families. So on the left, we've got Dorcas parallelepipedus, which is the lesser stag beetle. So we don't have any records of what you think of as the normal greater sort of stag beetle in the Cemetery Park, but we do have a lot of the lesser stag beetle, and these absolutely love all the sitting dead wood that we have. So these are one of those species that take many years, 4 or 5 years to develop as a larvae, and they do that all within rotting wood. And then they come out, they search for a mate, they breed, they lay eggs, and that's kind of their adult lifespan. Very short, but many, many years in rotten wood. And that's why the cemetery park is so fantastic for them. There's a lot of wood that doesn't get disturbed. It allows for these things that don't have many places to live to really thrive. Similar to some of the other species I mentioned, they're a little bit slow and a little bit dopey, and they're quite big. So they're really heavily predated on by things like foxes and the crows. So often you won't necessarily see the living individual, but you will often find bits of them strewn around, maybe where there's a few crows or foxes. In the middle, we've got a very out of focus picture of Odomera nobilis. This is known as a thick-legged flower beetle or thick-thighed beetle. These are really common on Ackroyd Drive, and they're in their natural habitat there where there's lots of flowers. They love the pollen. And the males of this species have, as you can see there on the femur, the beginning of the back legs, this really thick, swollen part of the thigh. The females don't have it, and they look a little bit, they're a bit smaller and a little bit indistinct. So often when you're in the cemetery park, if you peel back a bit of bark, you will come across these. They have very distinct larvae. Again, they live for many, many years, and then they come out as the adult and mate. These are often seen in the Memorial Glade area. So on a hot day, they'll fly around, and these are some of the ones that, as mentioned earlier, kind of fly at you by accident and get stuck into your hair because they're a little bit big and silly. So that's a brief overview of beetles as a whole. In the preparation for this, I had a little look at some of the specimens that I'd collected at the cemetery park before, and I came across this, which I remember collecting. I collected it from an old rotten giant puffball mushroom that was in Poplarwood, and it was kind of sitting there, so I thought I'd have a little look, take it apart, and inside I could find masses and masses of larvae and a few newly emerged adults of this. I wasn't quite sure where to start with it, so I had a look in the books, couldn't really find out what it was, put it away for a bit, and I dug it out the other day and started having a look, and I came up with Procadius ferruginus. There we are. And it seems like there's not many species, not many records of this in the UK. There's less than 200 records in the whole of the UK, from what I can see, but there doesn't seem to be any records of it in London, let alone the cemetery park. So I'm going to send this off to a verifier and see what they think. But I think this is another new species for the list, and potentially new to the city entirely. And with that, here's a little list of resources that I think are very helpful. So we have a species, well, the Friends have a species list on the website that's being curated by Edward Milner, who's the sort of long-term beetle identifier on site. So please do check that out if you want to know what you might find. There is a really good resource on the Natural History Museum's website by Katie Potts, who basically created a really good guide to just common families and species that you might find. If you're looking to get a little bit more interested, Mark Teffler and John Walters have some really good online resources. Mark Teffler seems to have taken his down recently, so maybe they're going to be published into a book, I don't know. And then if you are interested in books, I have 2 books that I highly recommend for getting into beetles and insects in general. And then there's some Facebook groups there as well. Other than that, thank you all very much for listening to me ramble on. And I hope you enjoyed, and I'm very happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you. I learned loads there. That was absolutely fantastic. I think there are a few questions in the chat, but people are welcome to turn their mics off as well if they'd like to ask in person. So anything in the chat, Michelle?
Yeah, I'll do the ones in the chat first, and if people want to add to that, they're welcome. But yeah, as Ken said, please feel free to turn your mics back on if you want to say it verbally. So first question was from Naomi, asking, what is the characteristic of a weevil?
Of you.
Characteristics of weevils. So some sort of adapted rostrum is a really key one.
You want to say something?
Oh, I can hear Judy very well
just
there.
Tell me what you want, and then it'll alert.
Hold on, Judy. Do you want to just mute yourself for a minute, Judy, because Dan's asking a question. Answering a question. Hold on.
So So it's this adapted rostrum that you can see here as one of the main ones. So on the left, you can see it, but on the right, these are known as broad-nosed weevils. And you can see they still have a nose there with the antenna sort of inserted into that nose there. You tend to know a weevil when you see them because they kind of a little bit round-bodied, a little bit sort of bulbous as well. The one in the middle is kind of less exemplary of that. But yeah, I'm sure there are many other key factors, but I don't have them to mind, I'm afraid.
Anything else?
Rachel said that yeah, I'm going.
Sorry.
Rachel said that she saw a rose chafer on the 25th of May in the Cemetery Park.
Fantastic. I do suspect they're there.
I'm surprised that you never saw them, Dan, when you were with us.
Yeah, okay. I knew someone was going to say it. Fantastic. Yeah.
Because because you were after photos, the last few weeks I've been wandering up and down Scrapyard Meadow to get you a picture for your presentation. I was looking on the roses and things and never saw one, so I'm glad that someone's seen one recently.
So I knew that I hadn't seen them, but I checked Edward Milner's list, and he hasn't got them recorded as well. So
yeah. Edward's list mainly pitfall trapping and a bit of sweep netting, so it's not as comprehensive as it might be.
You, Ken. You've got all the knowledge.
No, I haven't. I've learned loads from yours. Your presentation has been really good.
Cool. Sophie asks, what's the evolutionary benefit of a beetle being brightly coloured, like the cardinal beetle?
So generally, brightly colours imply toxic or horrible to eat. So the cardinal beetles are, I don't know specifically, but generally bright reds mean you're toxic. So the Coccinellidae, the Ladybirds, I don't know if you've ever sort of held one in your hand, but you'll often get this sort of horrible yellow gooiness that smells quite horrible, which is really distasteful. And so that's a warning colour there. Sometimes colours are used as a sort of a sexual characteristic, but generally red means there's something a bit off about me, you don't want to eat me.
Perfect, thank you. Ingrid says, it's most interesting. It's great to see you again, Dan.
Oh, good to hear from you too, Ingrid.
Bala, I hope I've pronounced your name right. How important are beetles in pollination? Are there any plants in the UK elsewhere that rely primarily on beetles for pollination?
That's a really good question. So they are very important in pollination. They're one of those ones that kind of gets left off sort of lists of pollinators. Obviously, people think of the bees first, and there's more and more people thinking of, say, hoverflies and butterflies at the moment. But so, for example, the rose chafer, let's bring that back up. Lots of these scarabs have a lot of hairs on their underside. So when they're going around from plant to plant, they are collecting pollen on those hairs, probably unintentionally in some manner, and then spreading them around to other flowers. I don't know if any, there may well be some that are very much beetle-specific pollinated, but unfortunately none are coming to mind at the moment.
Thank you. I find this next question very amusing. Marion, what are the red beetles that we see mating on wild carrots that we call rude beetles because they are bum to bum?
I know of them as bonking beetles, and those are the red soldier beetle. I'm going to have to quickly look up the name of it, but it's a red soldier beetle, I think, if you have a look at those up. But yeah, I've never seen them not in a pair or more. I've never seen them on their own. They always seem to be with another, enjoying the sunshine.
I think rude beetle should be the new common name for this species. Does anybody want, well, you can keep putting questions in the chat, or does anybody want to switch on their mics and ask a question in person? You're very welcome to.
Yeah, could I say something, Michelle?
Oh, please do, Terry.
What is it? It's not so much a question, it's just, I think Ken will back this up, that we have in fact been seeing rose chafers for 6 or 7 years, I'd say, in the early years, you'd see only one or two during the course of the spring and early summer, mostly in around Scrapyard Meadow and Cantrell Road. But this year there seems to be more than ever. I reckon I've seen about a dozen, including one today.
Wow.
That one was settled. So, but one thing that Dan probably knows, you can actually see it on this picture if you look closely. When you look at it, when you look at one settled, you think, oh, there's a bit of damage on the elytra. There's these irregular little white squiggles on both sides, and but they're not damaged. They're always there. Presumably Dan's noticed those. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know what significance they might have, but very odd. They really look like something has scratched or, harmed the elytra, but it hasn't.
There's another a similar species, the noble chafer, and I can't think of its technical name now, but that has it looks like it's really been through the works. It's been totally smashed up, but it's just really rough and sort of rugged. So I think it's something in that family that often you get that. I don't know why. I'm also just going to find a picture of...
Aggie says she seconds Terry. She can remember seeing a rose chafer beetle on a flower walk with Terry.
Well, it seems like everyone's seen them but me.
Don't worry, Dan, I haven't. But that won't be a surprise to you.
I did have a really good example in one of the pictures I took. I don't know if I used it in the presentation, of a deformed elytra in one of the ground beetles, but no, I don't think it's there. Where, do you see, going down the elytra, you have these stria, which are the sort of stripes that go down. And I have one specimen that the stria seem to merge, but just on one side. So it's very obviously a sort of a developmental issue. But it gives it a really interesting pattern, but only on one side. But unfortunately, I don't have that picture here.
And Rachel asks, is there a beetle that stings?
Oh, so this came up earlier. Stings, no, but there is the sort of bombardier beetles, which can propel an acidic mixture of substance out of their behind. And Ken and Terry might have a better memory of this than I do, but I feel like there is one small, maybe historic population of that in Marland Park. Does anyone have a...
Yeah, they introduced some in Marland Park as part of a reintroduction program when Michael Rowan was still the head of Marland Park. So yeah, they created some opportunities for them near the Palm Tree Pub, I believe.
Right. There's lots of wonderful slow motion videos of sort of the explosive nature of them, where they very much project this burning acidic substance onto competitors and predators.
Can I come in there? Or?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm on the business of, I think they call it, is it the streaked bombardier beetle? Edward Milner found them, I think, in the very far south of he found them right at the southern end of Marland Park, down by Rhodeswell Road. And I didn't know, I didn't actually know that there'd been a reintroduction attempt as well, but I think that was just trying to reinforce the population, presumably, that was there already. That's really all I know about them.
Cool. I'm going to go on to another question. Again, I'll ask this question, but then if anyone wants to turn on their mics, please feel free to. Sally asks, which animals eat beetles?
Loads. So you have the larger things. So we used to get outside of the Soane Centre when there was a lot of old logs there. That's where the lesser stag beetles would sort of grow up. And quite often we'd come in and the foxes would have completely destroyed all of the wood as they fished out all of these lesser stag beetle larvae. Birds love them because while they've got a really thick sort of protective covering to them, a bird beak can often just crunch them. So they're a great resource for birds. But there's also lots of things that sort of feed on them from the inside. So there'll be lots of parasites, so lots of wasps that will sort of lay eggs inside of beetles. There's also a fantastic parasitic wasp of ladybirds, which I can't remember the name of, but we have seen them on Scrapyard Meadow, where essentially the small wasp will lay an egg inside of a ladybird. That egg will then form a larvae. That larvae will develop inside the ladybird, and then it will make its way out, and having eaten a load of the sort of fatty and reproductive tissue in the abdomen of the ladybird, it will make its way out and then form a little sort of cocoon underneath the ladybird. And that ladybird will then sort of stay there, often still alive, protecting that parasite underneath it. And if something else comes along, the ladybird will often sort of rear up and have a little go at something else if it's coming in to try and get the wasp. So it kind of manipulates it into protecting the wasp larvae as it develops.
Well, that's it for questions on the chat. But if anybody has any others that they would like to, please feel free.
Yeah, hi Dan. This is Paula. Just a question about wormicides. The use of wormicides. What sort of impact is that having on dung beetles? Is that quite severe, or?
Yeah, so I said earlier that I used to do a lot of work on sort of creating extinction risk and things. There's a lot of evidence that a lot of medicines that are used in agriculture, such as wormicides, are having a big effect, because obviously they come out with the dung and then the beetles go into that dung. But ultimately, we don't know what it's doing on a sort of a population sort of scale, because we just don't know what the populations of these things generally are. We don't have that sort of monitoring in place to see what's happening with populations. We know sort of anecdotally, and we know with evidence that it does have an effect, a negative effect, but ultimately what it's doing on the population, at least that's how it was a few years back. Yeah, but I think there's been a lot more understanding recently of this sort of effect, and so a change in the way that medicine is applied. That sort of brings up a very famous example of Australia, where once sort of settlers and colonizers went to Australia and they brought all of their placental mammals with them. All these cows and horses were leaving dung everywhere, and there were no native dung beetles that could break down these things. There were native dung beetles, but they were used to the marsupial dung. And so dung was piling up, and it was leading to all sorts of diseases and sort of flies and parasites. And so eventually a load of dung beetles were introduced from all around the world to break down these cow and horse dung. So I feel like from my understanding in Australia, there's a lot more respect and reverence for the dung beetle than maybe in some other places.
Could I come in on that? I want to say that I know that even to this day that there are new experimental introductions of dung beetle species to Australia, partly I suppose because it's such a huge continent that what a dung beetle that might work in the tropics may not work in the temperate region, etc. But I did have a question for Dan about harlequin ladybirds, and that is, seems to me that the harlequin ladybird, as a sort of new arrival in the UK, it's only been here since 2004, but there are many other insects which are new arrivals, quite a lot of moths, for example. And what seems to happen is that when they first arrive, they may very, very quickly build up a very high population. But after a while, and I think this might be happening with the harlequin ladybird, after a while, the population seems to sort of get, to stabilize or even to reduce. And what I guess is that what happens is that native predators eventually often discover this new resource. Maybe some of the parasitic wasps, for instance, may find that they can deal with the harlequin ladybird. And so I don't really know whether that is the case, or whether Dan thinks that new insect introductions do have this pattern of rising rapidly and then stabilizing or going down.
So I think that's very true. This sort of equilibrium that it reaches, and I know that sort of there's been no real push for control over it because they've seen evidence of this sort of this leveling off, and it's sort of reaching some sort of level of symbiosis with other sort of native species. I think there's an idea of when things first arrive somewhere, so when there's an introduction, often there's quite a small genetic pool, and in the short term, a lot of breeding from a short genetic pool can lead to a lot of sort of advantages in a very short term that then in the long term start to come back and have repercussions. So that's when sort of inbreeding depression can start to happen. So there can often be this burst and expansion, but then a slowing down as things go on. So I think that's a very valid observation.
Great. Rachel asks, what is the beetle with the hardest shell? Does anybody know that information?
I like to think that no one's crushing them to find out. I don't know if I've come across that fact at all, but I can tell you that the larger ones, so the Titan beetles and things like that, they have thick shells. So I imagine the bigger the beetle you get, the thicker the shell in many cases. So the stag beetles have fairly thick exoskeletons generally. So I imagine some of the larger ones would have even thicker ones, but it's purely a guess. Have a look for some of the largest beetles in the world and you'll probably find some of the hardest shells, I imagine.
Great. Does anybody have any more questions via chat or verbal?
Hi, Dan. Thank you very much.
Hi, Aggie.
And talk. I learned a lot. It was very, very interesting and very good. Now that Terry mentioned the Harlequin beetle, a question came to mind. I don't know if I misunderstood, but I thought what you said was that the Harlequin beetle comes in many different colors and patterns. Is there any other beetle that does that in the UK?
Not that many. So as I said, the ladybirds often will have different forms. I think it's much more common in ladybirds than it is other groups. A lot of the carabids, the ground beetles, will have some variation. So some of them will be black and some of them will be a little bit more metallic blue. But is there anything as extreme as that? I don't think so. And I know that with the harlequins, so the forms that we get are only a tiny proportion of the forms that exist in its native population. But there's also been lab experiments to selectively breed to create new forms as well. So they have a lot of potential for various other forms that just don't occur naturally, or at least as far as we know. So it seems to be hypervariant.
Are the three photographs on the left, are they native on, are the harlequin on the right, and are there three on the...
Three on the left are all natives.
Oh,
yes.
right, okay. No,
Yes.
I have seen the yellow one. That's amazing.
I tended to find the yellow ones in the cemetery park. Just I'd look at my arm and it would be there, like luck, basically.
And if anyone, I'll just paste it at the bottom, the FSC talk Dan was mentioning about. The reason I had found that so easily was because I've got that as a tab that I need to really watch that because I think it's so interesting on the coloration, origins of coloration in invertebrates. So I'm just reposting that if anyone wants to get a bit more information on it.
It's really interesting because it's by a physicist, a material scientist. So they're obviously structuring their talk towards people who are interested in insects, but they have everything in a slightly different viewpoint, which is really fascinating. There's also, Michelle, are you able to put the Biological Record Centre's talks of the ladybirds, or shall I send that in to you later? Because they've got a really good one on identifying adult ladybirds, but also one on identifying juvenile larvae. And there's quite a few that are very easily identifiable. So you can quite easily identify the 7-spot and the harlequin without too much effort.
Yeah, could I come back on the harlequin ladybird, Dan? One question is, don't know, I've read that their sort of native area is somewhere in East Asia, which I presume that means somewhere around about Korea. I don't know whether you know that any more precisely.
Southeast Asia was the only reference point I have in
what I
mind.
do know about it, though, is that they have been taken around the world for, biological control. They've been in the United States for more than a century, and I think they were taken to southern Europe, and they worked their way up naturally until they got, when they got to Belgium and Holland. I think they established populations there, which came here by flying naturally across the North Sea, by migrating. So it's a funny example of something that's arrived by itself, but it wouldn't have done so without human action.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So we don't know. We just know Southeast Asia is where they originally come from. Yeah.
That's all I know.
Yeah. Well, it's more than I know.
Let me see if it's to easy reference. If people feel free to ask questions while I.
Sorry, Dan, I couldn't find that talk you were on about.
I can send it to you later to send to people if you want.
Yeah. Is it one of the FSC biodiversity?
No, it's the Biological Record Centre.
Right. Okay.
And the Ladybird recording scheme.
I think we've kind of reached our time there. So just from myself and the rest of the Cemetery Park, Dan, thank you very much for being part of our online programme of talks. That was absolutely fascinating insight into a very diverse subject. So really, really, really good. So thank you, Dan. And,
thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
That was absolutely brilliant. And thank you, everyone, for joining us and supporting the Cemetery Park. That's really appreciated too. But if you would like to turn your microphones off, we will all give Dan a round of applause.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you.